The call came at 2:44 a.m., splitting the silence of Byeong-Ho's penthouse like a blade through still water. Rand Byeong-Ho didn't startle. Men who commanded Seoul's most feared criminal syndicate didn't startle. They calculated. His empire stretched from the glittering towers of Gangnam to the ghost warehouses along the Han River's forgotten banks. And in 17 years, nothing had ever moved through those corridors without his permission. Not cargo, not information, not fear, not a single thing. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. International prefix. His lieutenants knew better than to call without identification. His enemies knew better than to call at all. He answered on the fourth ring. The voice that met him wasn't one of his men. It was a woman, breathless, clearly American, her English cracking at every syllable like ice giving way underfoot. She wasn't trained. She wasn't composed. Whatever had pushed her to dial this number had stripped every layer of rehearsal from her bones. Is this Rand Byeong-Ho? Please, you have to listen to me. My name is Shannon Holland. I'm calling from Seoul General ICU. He said nothing. In his world, silence was the sharpest interrogation tool. It's Glend Orozco. The name hit him somewhere he had spent 3 years cementing shut. She has 3 hours left. Maybe less. Byeong-Ho was already on his feet before the sentence finished. His body moving with the cold, mechanical precision of a man whose instincts had never once failed him. Black suit jacket from a chair. Phone tucked against his jaw. The SIG sour from the nightstand drawer because dangerous men stayed alive by never leaving home unarmed. And because whatever this was, it had the weight of something that would require more than words to survive. Why? He said, his voice carrying none of what was detonating quietly behind his ribs. Are you calling me? A breath. Then, because she never stopped, even when she was dying. She never stopped protecting you. His driver materialized from the corridor shadows the moment Byeong-Ho cleared the penthouse door. No words exchanged, no questions asked. That was the covenant between men like them. The black Mercedes cut through the empty Seoul streets like a rumor. Outside, the city blinked its indifferent neon. Inside, Byeong-Ho sat with both hands resting on his knees. Perfectly still, the posture of a man in absolute control. But his jaw was tight. And for the first time in 17 years, Rand Byeong-Ho, the man whose name alone could empty rooms, did not know what he was going to do when he walked through those hospital doors and saw the woman he had spent 3 years learning to hate. The woman who, apparently, had been dying the entire time. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I genuinely want to say hello to you and find out how far our story has traveled. Every comment reminds me someone out there is feeling every word of this. Seoul General's emergency entrance was not built for men like Rand Byeong-Ho. It was built for grief. For ordinary people arriving with ordinary catastrophes. Car accidents, cardiac events, the quiet collapses of aging bodies. It was built for families who needed directions, who asked politely, who waited in plastic chairs with paper cups of vending machine coffee, and the particular helplessness of people who had no other choice but to trust the system around them. Byeong-Ho walked through those sliding glass doors like the system had never applied to him. Because it hadn't. Not once in his adult life. 2 security guards moved to intercept him at the front desk. One look, just one, the kind that communicated precisely how many ways this interaction could end, and both men found reasons to be elsewhere. The night receptionist opened her mouth, closed it, and sat back down. Behind Byeong-Ho, 2 of his men in dark coats fanned out without instruction, positioning themselves at the entrance with the practiced ease of people who had done this in places far less sterile and far more dangerous. He approached the central desk alone. ICU. His Korean was quiet. Surgical. Floor and ward number. Now, the duty nurse, a woman in her 50s with the exhausted authority of someone who had handled 1,000 difficult nights, looked up from her monitor. She read him in approximately 3 seconds. Whatever she read made her reach for the phone, then stop herself, then reach for it again. "Sir, visiting hours don't begin until—" "Floor," he said, "and ward number." She gave them to him. The elevator was slow. Byeong-Ho took the stairs. He moved through the hospital's upper corridors with his jacket buttoned, his tie straight, his expression set to the particular blankness he wore when something inside him was working very hard not to surface. Orderlies pressed themselves to the walls as he passed. A young resident in scrubs stepped out of a supply room, saw him coming, and stepped back in. The ICU's outer ward doors required a code and a staff badge. The badge came from one of his men, who had acquired it from a cooperative administrator before the car had even left the penthouse garage. The code had taken his tech operative 4 minutes to pull from the hospital security system. Byeong-Ho entered without breaking stride. A charge nurse was on her feet immediately, professional outrage rising in her expression. "You cannot be in here. This is a restricted—" "Shannon Holland." He said the name like a key turning in a lock. "She called me. She's in here with a patient named Glend Orozco. Take me to them, or step aside and I'll find them myself." A bead of silence stretched between them. The nurse calculated her odds, calculated his, and made the correct decision. She led him down the corridor. He smelled the ICU before he fully entered it. Antiseptic and recycled air, and beneath that, something faint and medicinal that made the back of his throat tighten. The ward was dim, punctuated by the soft, rhythmic sounds of monitors, the low hum of machines performing the work that bodies had stopped doing on their own. Curtain bays on either side. The particular quiet of a place where people were hovering at a threshold, and the staff were the only things standing between them and what waited on the other side. The nurse stopped at the last bay on the right. Byeong-Ho stepped through the curtain and stopped. He had prepared himself in the car, in the elevator, in the long, controlled walk through the corridors. He had prepared himself the way he prepared for every situation that required him to function in the presence of something he didn't want to face. He had built the wall before arriving at what he needed the wall for. It was a discipline he had perfected over decades. It had never failed him. It failed him now. The woman in the bed was not the woman he remembered. He remembered Glend Orozco the way you remember sunlight. Not in careful detail, but in the quality of warmth it left behind. He remembered her laugh, which was the kind that arrived before she'd fully decided to let it out, quick and unguarded and completely at war with the composed intelligence she wore in every other moment. He remembered her hands, always moving when she spoke, tracing the shape of whatever idea she was pulling apart her mind. He remembered the way she'd looked at him in the early days, before his world became her world, with a particular mix of fascination and wariness that had made him want, for the first time in his adult life, to be someone worth the risk. The woman in the bed was pale in the specific way that flesh becomes pale when the body begins rationing its resources. Her cheekbones sat too close to the surface. The hospital gown, pale blue, patterned too large for what she'd become, swallowed her in a way that made his chest do something he refused to name. A catheter line ran into her left arm, a thicker line into a port near her collarbone. The ventilator wasn't breathing for her yet, but the way her chest rose and fell carried a labored quality, each breath its own small negotiation. Her eyes were open, and when they found him, when those dark, exhausted eyes tracked across the room and landed on his face, something passed through them that he hadn't seen in 3 years. Something that looked devastatingly like relief. Byeong-Ho. Her voice was almost nothing. A thread pulled too thin. He crossed the room in 4 steps and took her hand. He wasn't aware of having decided to do it. His body simply moved to close the distance. And then her hand was in his, lighter than he remembered, the bones closer to the surface. And he was standing there in his tailored black suit in a room full of machines, holding on. He did not speak. He was not yet capable of it. You came. Not a question. Something quieter than a question. He pressed her hand between both of his. Once. A single, controlled compression. The most he would allow himself. I came, he said. Movement at the edge of his vision. He turned. The woman standing on the opposite side of the bed was watching him with a particular expression of someone trying to determine how dangerous a situation had just become. She was younger than her voice had suggested on the phone. Late 20s, maybe 30, with dark curly hair pulled back from a face that was pale with exhaustion. She wore a deep maroon sweater and jeans, the civilian uniform of someone who had not dressed for this night, who had not expected to still be here at this hour, who had made a decision to make that call and was now living inside the consequences of it. Her hand rested near Glenn's leg on the blanket. Protective, deliberately positioned between the patient and the man who had just entered. Shannon Holland, Byeong-Ho said, yes. Her voice was steadier than it had been on the phone. She had gathered herself since then. He noted it. Thank you for coming. You said she had 3 hours. Shannon glanced at the monitors above the bed, then back to him. That was 40 minutes ago. He absorbed this without expression. Then stopped thanking me and started talking. Shannon looked at Glenn. Glenn gave the faintest movement. Not quite a nod, more the suggestion of permission. And Shannon exhaled once, slowly, like someone releasing the weight of something they had been carrying in secret for a very long time. Her name for what she has is Kessler, 9, Shannon began, keeping her voice low, clinical, controlled. The doctors here don't have a formal classification for it, because it's not a naturally occurring illness. It was engineered. She paused to let that land. It's a slow-acting biological toxin, designed to mimic autoimmune deterioration in its early stages, so it presents as lupus or MS or any number of things that take years to properly diagnose. By the time the body's immune response identifies it as foreign, the toxin has already bonded to the cellular tissue of the major organs. Liver, kidneys, eventually the heart. Byeong-Ho had not moved. His hand still held Glenn's. His eyes were on Shannon. She was infected 18 months ago, Shannon continued. But she was exposed over 2 years ago. Before she left Seoul, something shifted in his expression. Barely perceptible. Shannon saw it anyway. She wasn't running from you, Shannon said quietly, and the words had the weight of something she had rehearsed and then decided to say plainly anyway. She found out about the hit. The one your rivals placed on you through the port network. The biological package that was supposed to reach you through a dinner in Itaewon. She intercepted it. Not because anyone asked her to. Because Shannon stopped. Restarted. Because you were worth more to her than her own life was. And she knew that if she stayed, you would spend every resource you had trying to save her. She knew you would burn your entire empire to the ground chasing a cure. And she didn't want to be the thing that destroyed you. The monitor above the bed emitted its soft, steady rhythm. Byeong-Ho looked down at Glenn. Glenn was watching him. There was no apology in her expression. No performance of guilt or sorrow. Just the quiet, exhausted truth of a person who had made a choice and had been living inside it ever since. You should have told me, he said. His voice was very low. I know, she said. I spent 3 years, he stopped. The wall was working hard. I thought you betrayed me. I know that too. Glenn, I'm sorry, she said. And then, softer, I'm not sorry I did it. I'm sorry you had to carry that version of it. He looked away, toward the window, where Seoul's pre-dawn skyline glittered its indifferent neon beyond the glass. He breathed once, twice. Then he looked back at Shannon. What do the doctors here have? Palliative management. They're keeping her organs functioning with support. They don't have a treatment protocol for Kessler 9 because officially it doesn't exist. Shannon's voice stayed level, but something tightened at the edges. I've been keeping her hidden for 8 months, moving her between facilities, keeping her off the formal registries, making sure the people who did this couldn't trace her. Coming here was a last resort. Her kidneys began failing 6 days ago. I didn't have anywhere else to go. You were a deep cover operative, Byeong-Ho said. Not question. Shannon's expression shifted slightly. Former. Which agency? A pause. Doesn't matter right now. It matters to me. Another pause. Longer. Then, NIS. I went dark 4 years ago. Glenn found me in Manila. She didn't know what I was when we met. By the time she did, it didn't change anything for either of us. Shannon met his eyes steadily. I wasn't hiding her from you. I need you to understand that. The people who poison her, they're the same people who ordered the Itaewon package. They know she survived the initial exposure. They've been hunting her ever since because she carries proof of what they did in her blood work. If she reaches a lab equipped to analyze the toxin compound, she becomes a weapon against them. They can't allow that. Byeong-Ho processed this in the span of 4 seconds. He was already reorganizing, already calculating. The grief, if that was what the thing behind his ribs was, got folded back into the part of him that would deal with it later. The part of him that operated had already taken over. He pulled out his phone, and that was when he saw the nurse in the hallway. His gaze moved to her through the curtain gap naturally, the way a man with 17 years of surviving dangerous environments moves his eyes, constantly, unconsciously, cataloging everything. The nurse was standing near the station at the corridor's end. Her posture was correct. Her scrubs were correct. Her badge positioning was correct. Her boots were not. They were black, heavy-soled. The particular construction of footwear designed to allow fast movement over difficult terrain and still present as civilian. He had bought the same type for 6 of his own men. He looked at her hands. One was resting on a desk. The other was at her side, slightly away from her body in the way hands position themselves when they're prepared to reach for something. He scanned the corridor beyond. A second figure, male, orderly uniform, standing near the supply room door with the stillness of someone who is not waiting for supplies. Byeong-Ho closed the curtain fully and turned back into the room. His voice, when it came, had dropped to something barely above a murmur. Shannon. She read his expression and straightened immediately. The former operative surfacing. How many exits did you clock when you came in? Her eyes sharpened. 3. Stairwells at both ends of the corridor and a service elevator near the nurse's station. Why? She stopped. Looked at his face. They're here. 2 that I can't confirm. Possibly more I haven't located yet. He was already moving to the window, not opening it, just checking angles, checking sight lines, calculating. The floor was too high for a drop. The exterior wall faced an inner courtyard. He turned back. How mobile is she? Byeong-Ho. Glenn's voice from the bed. Quiet but clear. He looked at her. Don't, she said. Don't move me. If you disconnect the lines, I'm not leaving you here. The risk is mine to carry. He came back to the bed, and when he took her hand again, it was with a different quality than before, deliberate, decided. You carried it for 3 years. That's finished now. He looked at Shannon. My facility at Buchanan, private medical team, full ICU capability, and the kind of security that would have stopped whatever walked into this hallway from getting within a kilometer of the building. I'm moving her. Shannon was already running calculations behind her eyes. The mountain road is a vulnerability. If they have support outside, they will. He was on his phone now, typing, which is why my motorcade is going to be very loud and very visible, and Glend is going to be in a vehicle that isn't part of it. He glanced up. I need 8 minutes to position the units. Can you manage the equipment transfer? Shannon looked at the lines, the monitors, the port in Glenn's collarbone. Her jaw set. I was a field medic for 2 years before I went deep cover. I can keep her stable for 30 minutes in a moving vehicle if I have the right equipment. Make a list. You have 4 minutes. The doctors won't allow. They won't be consulted. He was already moving toward the curtain. He stopped, turned back once more to look at Glend. She was watching him the way she had when he first walked in, with that exhausted, quiet relief. But underneath it now, something else. Something that looked like the particular piece of a person who had been carrying a secret alone for a very long time and had finally, at great cost, been allowed to set it down. Byeong-Ho, she said, don't use your energy. I need to say this. He waited. I didn't think you'd come. A breath. Careful and slow. I hoped, but I didn't think. Glend. His voice was controlled. Everything underneath, it was not. You can finish that thought when you're not attached to a ventilator support system in a building that's been compromised. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was necessary. There will be time. He said it like a promise, like a man who had the power to make the universe keep it. Then he slipped through the curtain and moved into the corridor, and the two figures in their incorrect boots had no idea, in the 40 seconds they had left before Byeong-Ho's men arrived, that the most dangerous decision of their evening had been walking into the same building as him. Outside the window, Seoul was beginning its slow lean toward dawn. The sky at the horizon held the first diluted gray of approaching morning. Not light yet, not warmth, just the suggestion of both. The city's towers blinked their patient neon. The Han River moved somewhere below, invisible and constant. In Bay 7 of the ICU, Shannon Holland moved with quiet efficiency between the machines, checking lines, logging equipment, preparing to do something that every medical protocol she had ever been taught said she absolutely should not do. And on the bed, Glend Orozco, who had spent 3 years intercepting a bullet she was never supposed to survive, who had watched herself diminish by degrees in a series of dim rooms in cities that were not home, who had made the choice on a Manila night 8 months ago to finally let Shannon make the call, closed her eyes. She did not sleep. She listened to the sound of Byeong-Ho's voice in the corridor, low and certain and utterly without doubt, and felt something in her chest do what the machines around her had been working very hard to do on their own. It steadied. Comment below and tell me where in the world you're reading this from. I want to say hello to every single one of you. And if this story is pulling you in, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The night is far from over. The motorcade left Seoul General's underground parking structure at 4:17 a.m. with the kind of noise designed to be noticed. 3 black SUVs, headlights on full, engines tuned to announce themselves. Byeong-Ho's men drove them hard and fast through the empty pre-dawn streets heading north, the convoy's formation tight and deliberate, radiating the particular energy of a principal protection detail that wanted to be seen, wanted to be followed, wanted whoever was watching from the hospital's perimeter to make exactly the calculation they were meant to make. It took 90 seconds for the tale to materialize. 2 vehicles, dark gray, no plates. They emerged from a side street 2 blocks from the hospital with the practiced smoothness of people who had been staged and waiting, and they fell in behind the last SUV with a confidence that suggested they believed this was already over. It wasn't. 4 blocks away, moving without headlights through the back streets of Songbuk-dong, a plain white medical transport van carried Glend Orozco, Shannon Holland, and a field-trained paramedic named Wu who had worked for Byeong-Ho's organization for 11 years and asked no questions that weren't medically necessary. Shannon sat with her back against the van's interior wall, one hand monitoring Glenn's pulse oximeter, The other braced against the floor as the van took corners with the controlled speed of a driver who knew exactly where he was going and why urgency mattered without panic. Glenn lay on the portable gurney, her eyes half open, the portable force stand swaying gently above her. The transfer from the ICU bed had taken 6 minutes and 40 seconds. Shannon had counted every one of them. Stable, Shannon asked Wu. Pressure is low but holding. He adjusted the flow on the 4-line with practiced fingers. She needs the facility. 20 minutes, Shannon said. To herself, as much as anyone. On the other side of the city, the motorcade was no longer moving in a straight line. The first contact came on the Dongbu Expressway, a precision maneuver, the lead chase vehicle accelerating to close the gap while the second swung wide to flank. Professional, coordinated, the kind of tactical driving that came from genuine training rather than improvisation. Byeong-Ho's lead driver had expected it and responded before the flanking vehicle finished its arc, braking hard to break the trap's geometry while the second and third SUVs adjusted their spacing. The convoy didn't stop. It didn't scatter. It reconfigured like an organism that had rehearsed for exactly this. Inside the second SUV, Byeong-Ho sat in the rear left seat and watched the pursuit through the side window with the expressionless focus of a man who had made his calculation and was now simply executing it. His phone was in his hand, tracking 2 signals simultaneously. The white van's GPS moving cleanly through the back routes toward Bekanson, and the real-time feed from his security chief, Park, who was coordinating the decoy operation from follow vehicle 3 blocks behind the chase. They've committed both units to us, Park said through the earpiece. No third vehicle breaking off. They don't know about the van, Byeong-Ho said. Not yet. Keep them interested. What followed was 11 minutes of controlled violence through the gray pre-dawn streets of Seoul. Not a chase so much as a managed confrontation, the motorcade drawing the pursuit deeper into Byeong-Ho's chosen geography, away from the hospital, away from the van's route, into the industrial corridors of Songdong-gu, where his people knew every camera blind spot and every street wide enough to make a turn that the pursuing vehicles, slightly heavier and slightly less familiar with the terrain, would take a half-second longer to execute. Half a second, in this context, was a significant margin. The resolution came not with gunfire, but with precision. A single flatbed truck positioned by Park's team rolled across the expressway junction at the correct moment, and the pursuing vehicles had to choose between a collision and a stop. They stopped. By the time they had reversed and found an alternate route, the motorcade had dissolved into the city's pre-dawn arterials, its 3 vehicles peeling off in separate directions with the practiced efficiency of a team that had run dispersal drills more times than any of them had stopped to count. The white van reached the Bekanson facility at 4:51 a.m. Byeong-Ho arrived 7 minutes later. The mountain facility was not what it appeared to be from its exterior. A modest compound set into the lower slopes of Bekanson National Park, the kind of building that suggested a private research retreat or a wealthy family's discreet country property. Inside, it was something else entirely. Byeong-Ho had built it 11 years ago for contingencies, stocking it with the kind of medical infrastructure that existed in the gap between what legitimate hospitals could offer and what men in his position sometimes required. Full ICU capability, a surgical suite, a staff of 3, a physician named Dr. Lim who had left a distinguished career in academic medicine for reasons that had never been formally documented, a nurse anesthetist, and a lab technician, who lived on site and operated under a very thorough confidentiality arrangement. Dr. Lim met them in the intake corridor with the expression of a man who had been briefed by phone and was already working 3 problems simultaneously in his mind. "Get her onto the bed in Suite 2, he said, moving alongside the gurney without preamble. "I want a full panel, liver enzymes, renal function, cardiac markers, and whatever your lab can synthesize from her blood work in terms of identifying the toxin compound. He glanced at Shannon. You have medical training? Field level. I've been managing her care for 8 months. Then you know her baseline better than I do. Stay close. He looked at Byeong-Ho for exactly 1 second. I need the room. You have it, Byeong-Ho said. He stood in the corridor outside Suite 2 and listened to the sounds of organized medical urgency on the other side of the wall. The efficient shorthand of people who knew what they were doing, equipment being positioned, Dr. Lim's voice giving instructions in the measured cadence of someone who worked best under pressure. He stood with his jacket still on and his hands at his sides, and he breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth. And he did not allow himself to do anything with the thing that had been building in his chest since the moment he'd walked into that hospital bay and seen what 3 years in a slow-acting toxin had done to Glend Orozco. Not yet. His phone rang. Park. The 2 units we burned on the expressway. We pulled their vehicle registration. Both traced back to shell companies registered to a logistics firm in Incheon. A pause. The firm is a subsidiary of Daejin Maritime. Byeong-Ho was very still. Say that again. Daejin Maritime, sir. Registered to. I know who it's registered to. His voice had gone to a place that was several degrees below its normal temperature. I know exactly who it's registered to. Kim Yun-suk. A name from 7 years ago. A man Byeong-Ho had spent 3 of those years systematically dismantling. His operations, his networks, his access to the port systems that had made him powerful. A man Byeong-Ho had been certain, by the end of it, had either died or gone aground deep enough to be functionally irrelevant. A ghost. The ghost Shannon had referenced without naming. The rival Byeong-Ho thought he had eliminated, who held the only antidote to what was killing Glend. Because of course he did, because Kim Yun-suk had always understood that the most durable form of leverage was the kind that couldn't be seized or burned. Find him, Byeong-Ho said. Everything you have. I want a location within 3 hours. And if he's moved his base of operations outside Seoul, then find out where he moved it. He ended the call. He looked at the wall of Suite 2. Behind it, the machines were working. Dr. Lim was working. Shannon was working. Everyone was doing what they could do, and Byeong-Ho was standing in a corridor because for the first time in 17 years, the thing that needed fixing was not something he could reach with his hands or solve with his resources or resolve by moving the right pieces to the right positions on the board. He was waiting, and he had always been profoundly, fundamentally bad at it. The door to Suite 2 opened 40 minutes later. Shannon came out first, pulling it half closed behind her. She looked like she'd aged 3 years since the hospital corridor. Her curly hair had come loose from its tie, and her maroon sweater had a small smear of something on the left cuff that she either hadn't noticed or had stopped caring about. She's asking for you, Shannon said. How is she? Lim has her stabilized. The portable equipment did what it needed to do. Shannon looked at him directly. Her liver function has deteriorated since yesterday's readings. He thinks we have a window. Days, maybe a week at the upper end, if we can manage the organ pressure. She paused. He needs the antidote compound. Not just the drug, the synthesis data. Without understanding the toxin's exact molecular structure, any treatment is educated guessing. I know where the data is, Byeong-Ho said. Shannon studied him for a moment. Of course you do. Something in her expression relaxed slightly. Not trust, exactly, but the beginning of it. The recognition of a person who operated in a different world but toward, in this moment, the same end. She's asking for you, she said again, and stepped aside. The suite was dim. Dr. Lim had reduced the overhead lighting and left a single warm lamp burning near the window, and in that light the room looked almost nothing like an ICU. Almost. The machines were still there, quieter than Seoul General's, more modern, their displays reduced to soft amber readings that Byeong-Ho had trained himself, over years of contingency planning, to read at a glance. Glenn's numbers were not good. They were not, for this moment, actively worse. She was awake. More awake than she had been at the hospital. The transfer, or the different medication balance Lim had initiated, had surfaced her from the half-submerged state she'd been in before. Her eyes were clear. Too clear, in the way eyes sometimes became at the edge of serious exhaustion, when the body stops spending energy on anything except absolute necessity and the gaze takes on a quality of stripped-down directness. Byeong-Ho sat in the chair beside the bed. He didn't take her hand this time. He just sat and looked at her and waited for whatever she needed to say. "The city," she said. Her voice was stronger than it had been. Still thin, still careful, but present. Was there trouble? Handled. She almost smiled. Of course it was. A breath. Byeong-Ho, I need to ask you something. Ask. I need you to actually hear it. Not, she stopped. Reformulated. Not the way you hear things when you're already planning around them. He looked at her. I'm listening. She was quiet for a moment, gathering herself, and he watched the effort of it. The slight tightening around her eyes, the careful management of breath that had become necessary for the simplest acts of expression. He watched it and kept his face arranged in a steadiness because she didn't need his reaction right now. She needed the space to finish her thought. If this doesn't work, she said, if whatever you're planning doesn't get here in time, I need you to let me go. He said nothing. I mean it. Her eyes held his. I've watched you for 3 years from distance. Watched the things you carried. The way you moved through the world after I left. I had enough contacts still who'd tell me things. Shannon would hear things. I know what that version of you looked like. She paused. I don't want to be the thing that shapes the next 3 years of you. Or the next 10. I don't want to be the reason you go further into the dark. Glenn, let me finish. Quiet. Firm. More of her than he'd heard since he walked in as Soul General. There's a version of your life that doesn't have to be what it's been. I believe that about you since the beginning. Since before I understood what I'd gotten into back when you were just the most complicated person I'd ever met. A ghost of something crossed her face. You are more than what you built, Byeong-Ho. You always were. And if I don't make it through this, I want you to take whatever you would have spent on grief and spend it on becoming that instead. A clean life. Not for me. For you. But she almost smiled again, and this time it reached. It would make me very happy. So maybe a little for me. The monitor above her kept its steady rhythm. Byeong-Ho looked at her for a long time. The lamp made a warm geometry of the room around them. Outside, the mountain held its pre-dawn silence. You're not going to die, he said finally. You can't know. I know where the antidote synthesis data is. His voice was level. I know who has it. My team is moving on that location before sunrise. He leaned forward slightly in the chair, his elbows on his knees, bringing himself closer to eye level with her. What you're asking me to do with my life, that is a conversation I will have with you when you're not hooked to 3 different machines in my mountain facility at 5 in the morning. When you are recovered enough to argue with me properly, the way you used to, when you didn't pull your punches and you told me every difficult thing you thought I needed to hear. He held her gaze. I will hear all of it then. Every word. I give you my word on that. She looked at him. Something in her face was doing several things at once. Fighting, softening, the exhausted relief of being seen clearly by someone who had once known you completely and still chose to show up. That's not a no, she said. It's not a no. It's also not a yes to what I asked. No, he agreed. It isn't. A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that exists between 2 people who have a long, complicated history and are too tired and too honest, in this moment, to fill it with anything that isn't real. Go do what you're going to do, she said finally. He stood, straightened his jacket. looked at her one more time with the expression she'd spent 3 years trying to remember correctly and had never quite managed. That particular combination of absolute resolution and something underneath it that he allowed very few people to see. Rest, he said, and left. Park had a location by 5:40 a.m. Kim Yun-suk had not, as it turned out, gone as far as one might hope. He'd move his primary operation out of Seoul proper after Byeong-Ho's systematic dismantling of his port network, relocating to a converted industrial compound in Saihung, 40 minutes south of the city near the reclaimed waterfront. It was, by all external appearances, a cold storage and logistics operation. It was, by every intelligence indicator Park's team had assembled in 3 hours, also the site of a private research archive, the kind that contained the kind of information that powerful men kept off digital servers precisely because digital servers, regardless of their encryption, could be found and breached by people like Byeong-Ho's tech operative, a 26-year-old named Cho, who had once penetrated a government defense contractor's mainframe on a Tuesday afternoon out of what he described as mild professional curiosity. The synthesis data for Kessler 9 was in that archive. Shannon had confirmed it based on intelligence she had gathered during her NIS operational period. Intelligence she had apparently been sitting on for the better part of 2 years, waiting for a moment when it became the relevant piece. This was that moment. The team that moved on the Saihung compound at 6:15 a.m. was 6 people. Not Byeong-Ho's largest deployment, and not his most heavily armed. This was not a siege, and it was not a punishment. Not yet, and Byeong-Ho was precise enough in his thinking to separate what this operation needed from what he personally wanted to do to Kim Yun-suk's entire infrastructure. What this operation needed was speed, silence, and Cho's ability to locate and extract a specific set of files from a physical archive without triggering the compound security protocols in a way that would result in the data being destroyed before they could reach it. Byeong-Ho stayed at the facility. He did not stay because Park asked him to, or because Dr. Lim required his presence, or because any practical logic demanded it. He stayed because Glend had asked him not to be the thing that shaped the next version of himself through absence, and because standing 6 feet from a room while his team executed an operation he'd planned and directed was the first time in 17 years that he had chosen to be somewhere other than the front of a dangerous situation, and he was still deciding how he felt about that. He stood in the facility's small outer room and drank coffee that was too strong and watched the sky through the window change from charcoal to pale gray to the tentative first blue of genuine morning. Buchanan's ridgeline emerged from the dark gradually, the way things did when you stopped trying to force them into clarity and simply waited. His phone updated at 6:52 a.m. Archive located. Physical drives. Cho working extraction now. Compound security unaware. Estimated 12 minutes. At 7:08 a.m., extraction complete. Returning. At 7:11 a.m., Park sent a second message that contained only a name and a set of coordinates. Kim Yun-suk had been located in a private office on the compound's upper level. He had not been touched. Park was asking for instruction. Byeong-Ho held the phone for a long moment. Then he typed, "Leave him. For now." It was not mercy. It was the particular restraint of a man who understood that some reckonings were more effective when they arrived at the correct time and in the correct form, rather than immediately and emotionally. Kim Yun-suk would have his accounting, but it would not happen while Glend was in a bed 40 meters away needing every resource Byeong-Ho had to be directed at keeping her in it. He put the phone in his pocket and went to find Dr. Lim. The drives arrived at the facility at 7:44 a.m. Cho had them connected to his portable workstation within minutes, his fingers moving across the keyboard with the focused energy of someone who had been awake for 22 hours and would not consider stopping until the task was finished. He was a slight young man with round glasses and the kind of deep-set concentration that made him practically invisible in most social situations, which had always been, Byeong-Ho had observed, a significant professional advantage. The synthesis data for Kessler 9 was there, encoded in a proprietary format that took Cho 40 minutes to crack and render into readable documentation. But there, detailed, complete, the molecular architecture of the toxin laid out with the clinical precision of people who had designed it to be weaponized and therefore needed to understand exactly. Dr. Lim read it with Shannon at his shoulder. They were quiet for a long time. "There's an antidote compound," Lim said finally. His voice carried the careful neutrality of a physician delivering information that has two possible shapes. "The synthesis protocol is here. It's not," he paused. "It's not a standard treatment. It was designed as a kill switch by the toxin's creators. A way to deactivate the compound in a subject they wanted to preserve." He looked up from the screen. "Which means it works. But it was designed for laboratory conditions with precisely calibrated dosing for a specific subject body weight and organ function profile." "What does that mean for her?" Byeong-Ho said. Lim set the tablet down on the workstation desk and gave Byeong-Ho the full weight of his attention. This was Byeong-Ho had learned over their 11 years of association. How Lim indicated that what he was about to say required the other person's complete presence. "It means I can synthesize it," Lim said. "My lab here has what I need, or close enough that I can make it work. It will take approximately 8 to 10 hours. He folded his hands. "And it means the treatment, once administered, will either deactivate the toxin compound and allow her organs to begin recovering, or will trigger an acute systemic reaction that her body, in its current state, does not have the reserve to survive." The room was quiet. Shannon had her arms crossed over her chest. She was looking at the floor. The expression on her face was the expression of someone who had been living with terrible odds for 8 months and had become fluent in them. "What are the probabilities?" Byeong-Ho said. "I can't give you clean numbers. Her organ function affects the calculus significantly, and it's been declining." Lim's voice was measured. "My honest assessment, if we administer the antidote and she responds positively, she recovers. If she doesn't respond positively," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "And without it," Lim was quiet for a moment. "Without it, we are managing a deterioration. Her liver function this morning is significantly worse than yesterday. I believe we have," a pause, "the weight of clinical honesty. Perhaps 72 hours of organ support before we enter a phase where support itself is no longer sufficient." Byeong-Ho absorbed this. 72 hours against an 8-hour synthesis and then a treatment that might save her or might end her. Those were the parameters. That was the geometry of the choice, and it was he recognized with the part of himself that had always understood the structure of impossible decisions, not actually a choice at all. It was a calculation, and calculations, unlike emotions, had a correct answer. "Synthesize it," he said. Lim nodded once. He had already, Byeong-Ho suspected, known what the answer would be. "There's one more thing," he said. "The decision to administer, that isn't mine to make unilaterally. And it isn't yours." He looked at Byeong-Ho with the directness of a man who had operated outside conventional structures long enough to still retain the ones that mattered. "It's hers." She was awake when he came in. The morning light had found the suite's window and was doing what morning light does in rooms where difficult things have been happening, making everything look both harsher and more bearable simultaneously. The way daylight strips away the particular drama of darkness and replaces it with something more plain and therefore, in its plainness, more real. Byeong-Ho sat down. He told her what they had found, what Dr. Lim had said, what the antidote compound was, and what it could do in either direction. He told her all of it without softening the edges, because she had never responded well to softened edges, and because she deserved to receive the truth in its actual shape. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Her eyes moved to the window, to the pale morning blue beyond the glass, to the ridgeline of Buchanan sitting clean and indifferent above them. The mountain did not care about any of this. There was something almost useful about that. "How long for the synthesis?" she asked. 8 to 10 hours. "And Lim thinks it'll work. Lim thinks it has a meaningful chance of working." He held her gaze. That's the most accurate version of what he said. She almost laughed, a breath of air that wasn't quite a laugh but carried the shape of one. "You really don't soften anything, do you? You told me once you hated when I did." "I did say that." She looked at him. The stripped-down clarity was still in her eyes, that quality of exhaustion that had moved through pretense and come out the other side into something simpler. "I want to try it," she said. "The antidote. I know. You knew before you came in here. I suspected." He paused. "I wanted you to know it was your decision." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with an expression he remembered from years ago, from conversations in his Gangnam apartment when she was still learning the full shape of his world, and he was still learning that someone could know that shape and stay anyway. The expression of a person who is seeing something clearly and choosing to say so. "You've changed," she said. Soft, not an accusation. "Have I?" "You came in this morning, and the first thing you did was hold my hand." Ran Byeong-Ho, who I have personally watched make 3 men cry simply by staying silent in a room, came in here and held my hand. She paused. "And just now you said it was my decision. The old version of you would have had Lim administer it while I was sleeping and told me afterward." He said nothing. "I'm not complaining," she said. "I'm just noticing." Something in her face moved, a softness that her illness had stripped of its usual composure and left more visible than she probably intended. "I think I might have done something useful after all, intercepting that package. If it made you," she stopped. "Don't," he said. "I'm just saying, Glend." His voice was low. "When you are recovered, when Lim has given you a clean reading and Shannon has stopped looking at you like you might disappear if she takes her eyes off you for 30 seconds, we're going to have a very long conversation about what you did and what it cost and what it gave, and I'm going to participate in that conversation like a person who is capable of discussing difficult things instead of routing around them." He held her gaze. "That conversation is going to happen, but it is not going to happen right now, in this room, with you at 30% and the morning barely started." She looked at him for a long moment. "Okay," she said. "Okay. Byeong-Ho." "Yes. Thank you for coming." A pause. "I know I said that before. I mean it differently now." He looked at her. The pale face, the machines, the morning light making everything plain and bearable and real, and he felt the thing behind his ribs do what it had been trying to do since 2:44 a.m. Surface. He let it this time, just for a moment. Just enough. "Go to sleep," he said. "I'll be here when Lim is ready." The antidote was synthesized by 4 in the afternoon. Dr. Lim administered it at 4:22 p.m., with Shannon on one side of the bed and Byeong-Ho on the other. And for the first 90 minutes there was nothing to do but watch the monitors and wait. Byeong-Ho was not good at waiting. He had established this fact about himself thoroughly over the course of the day. He sat in the chair beside the bed and watched the amber readings on the displays and kept his breathing even and his expression neutral and his hands still, which was more effort than any operation he had run in 17 years. At the 90-minute mark, Glenn's blood pressure dropped sharply and every person in the room moved at once. Lim to the medication drawer, Shannon to the monitor, Byeong-Ho to his feet, his hand finding hers without any decision being made about it. The next 4 minutes were the longest of his life, and he had lived a life that contained several categories of long minutes. Then the pressure stabilized. Lim rechecked the reading. Rechecked it again. His expression did not change. It was a physician's expression, trained to withhold, but something in his posture shifted by a nearly imperceptible degree. Her immune markers, he said, looking at the blood work panel Cho had been running continuously. He picked up the tablet. Read it. Set it down. The toxin compound, the cellular bonding pattern has changed. He looked at Byeong-Ho and then at Shannon with the expression of a man who had spent 30 years practicing restraint and was currently finding it a significant effort. It's responding. The antidote is working. Shannon made a sound that was not words. Byeong-Ho stood with Glenn's hand in both of his and said nothing for a long moment. He looked at her face, still pale, still exhausted, the lines of her illness still present. But the monitors above her were speaking in a different register now, and Dr. Lim was speaking in a different register, and Shannon was pressing the back of her hand to her mouth and blinking very hard at the ceiling. Glenn's eyes opened. Slowly, she looked at the ceiling first, then at Shannon, then at Byeong-Ho. What happened, she said. Her voice was barely audible. The antidote is working, Byeong-Ho said. She stared at him. Processing. The machinery of her mind, even diminished, working carefully through what he'd said and what it meant. Oh, she said. Yes. Her hand tightened around his. A small, imprecise pressure. She didn't have much strength yet, but deliberate. Chosen. Okay, she said. He looked down at her. Outside the window, Bukhanson held its mountain silence. Below them somewhere, Seoul was doing what Seoul always did. Moving, burning its neon, filling its streets with the ordinary machinery of a city that did not pause for anyone's private earthquakes, no matter how large. None of it reached them here. Okay, he said back. A year is a long time. It is also, depending on what you've carried through it, not very long at all. The garden at the back of the Bukhanson facility had not, when Byeong-Ho purchased the property 11 years ago, been a garden. It had been a maintenance yard, concrete, a few overgrown shrubs, the kind of utilitarian space that exists to be ignored. Somewhere in the weeks after the night Glenn's antidote took hold and the long process of her recovery began, Byeong-Ho had found himself standing in that space one morning with coffee in his hand and the thought that it could be something else, and had for reasons he didn't examine too carefully called a landscape architect. By the following spring, it was something else. Stone paths. A bench under a persimmon tree that had taken to the mountain air with the enthusiasm of something long waiting for the right place to grow. Raised beds that Glend, in the early weeks of her recovery, had looked at from the window with the evaluative expression she brought to things she was planning to involve herself in once she had the strength. By midsummer, she had the strength. By early autumn, she was the one with opinions about what grew where, and Byeong-Ho had discovered, to neither his surprise nor his displeasure, that he was willing to concede most of them. It was late afternoon now, the light going golden over the ridgeline, the persimmon tree doing what persimmon trees do in autumn, holding its fruit against the cooling air with the particular stubbornness of something that has survived worse. Glend was sitting on the bench with her feet tucked up under her, a book open in her lap that she hadn't been reading for the last several minutes. She was watching a small bird investigate the raised beds with the focused attention she brought to small things now. Things that had been easy to ignore when the future felt uncertain and the present felt like something to endure. She looked well. Not the way she had looked before. There were still traces of what the illness had done, a carefulness in how she moved, a rest she still needed in the afternoons that she'd initially resisted and eventually accepted, but well, present. Herself. Byeong-Ho came out of the building's side door and crossed the stone path to the bench. He sat down beside her. He was wearing a shirt without a jacket, which was still, she maintained privately, slightly remarkable. Ran Byeong-Ho in a garden on a Tuesday afternoon in a white shirt with his sleeves rolled to the elbow, watching a bird. The universe contained unexpected things. He had been in Seoul that morning for a meeting. A legitimate meeting. The kind that happened in offices with lawyers and documentation. The kind that produced paper trails rather than erasing them. The process had been slow, and it had been complicated, and it had required, as these things did, a particular appetite for dismantling what you had built carefully and replacing it with something whose rewards were less immediate and less legible to the part of yourself that had grown up understanding power in a very specific vocabulary. He was doing it anyway. He was several months into doing it anyway, which was far enough in that the doing of it had become, if not easy, at least familiar. Glenn had not told him to. She had said in the ICU suite that she wanted it for him. She had not repeated herself, because she was not a person who repeated herself about things she'd said plainly. She had said it once and left him the entire rest of the space to decide. He had decided. "How was the city?" she asked without looking away from the bird. "The same." "Your meeting?" "Productive." He paused. "The Incheon assets close by the end of the month. The Mapo properties are transferred to the registered entity by the end of next quarter." She nodded slowly. "And Kim Yun-suk?" Her voice was steady. She had been told everything in pieces over the months about what Park's team had found on the drives, about the compound in Saihong, about Byeong-Ho's decision to leave him untouched that morning. His operation in Saihong was reported to the NIS last week, Byeong-Ho said, through appropriate channels. He paused. Shannon made the report. Glenn turned to look at him at that. Something in her expression moved, something that combined, in the way her expressions often combine things, several separate responses into one. "She didn't tell me. She wanted to be clean." Her word. Byeong-Ho looked out over the garden. "She said she owed you a clean resolution." Glenn was quiet for a moment. She looked back at the persimmon tree, its fruit catching the late light, the bird having moved on to somewhere else. "Shannon is going to make someone a very complicated friend," she said finally. "She already has," Byeong-Ho said. Glenn almost laughed. This time it fully arrived. Not the threat of sound from the ICU, but the real thing, brief and warm and entirely unguarded. The laugh he remembered from the beginning that had arrived before she'd fully decided to let it. It landed in the garden, and the garden held it, and the mountain was still, and the light was going, and the persimmon tree stood in it with the patient certainty of something that had found its right place. He looked at her. She looked back. There was a great deal between them. 3 years of a false version of a story, a biological toxin designed by someone who had wanted to use her life as leverage, a 2:44 a.m. phone call that had brought an empire to a single point and forced it to decide what it was actually for. There is all of that, still present the way things that have shaped you are always present, worn smooth now by the months of slow work and the long conversations he had promised her and kept, the difficult things said and received and sat with, and eventually integrated. There was also this, a garden, a persimmon tree, a late autumn afternoon, and 2 people who had arrived at the same place by very different and very costly routes and were, against the considerable odds the universe had arranged against them here. "The 2:44 a.m. call," she said. She said it the way you say something you think about sometimes when you're alone, not to open it up, just to acknowledge it. To name it. "Yes. I've been thinking about it." She looked at him. Shannon agonized over making it. She told me she sat there for 40 minutes with your number in her hand before she dialed. She didn't know who you'd be when you answered. She didn't know if calling you was going to save my life or end it. She made the right call. She did. Glenn was quiet for a moment. "I think about what would have happened if she hadn't. If I just," she stopped. "If the version of this had been the one I asked for in the ICU. The clean life for yourself. Me letting go." He said nothing. "I'm glad it wasn't that version," she said. Simple and direct, in the way she'd always said the things that mattered. He looked at her in the late light. The garden, the mountain, the afternoon going gold around them, and he felt the thing that had been trying to surface since 2:44 a.m. and had been across all the months and the work and the long conversations finally allowed to settle. Not gone, not resolved into something clean and simple, just settled, present, a thing he knew how to carry now, differently than he'd carried everything before. "So am I," he said. The light continued doing what it does, moving, shifting, beginning the long, unhurried process of becoming evening. The mountain held its silence. Below them, the city existed, indifferent and constant. The persimmon tree held its fruit against the cooling air. In ran Byeong-Ho, who had built an empire out of control and the refusal to be surprised, sat in a garden on a Tuesday and let the afternoon pass without managing it, which was, as it turned out, enough. If this story reached you, if you felt even one moment of it, subscribe and leave a comment below. Tell me where in the world you're reading from. I want to know how far these characters have traveled. Every single name in that comment section is proof that a story, told right, crosses every border there is.